my goal with this presentation is to present a challenge to what I think is a common view in philosophy, but also in common sense and psychology. And this common view says that conscious thoughts constitutively involve images. So according to this view, a creature who lacked images would not be capable of having conscious thinking. And by images here, I mean something very broad. So that includes sensory representations of all sensory modalities like visual and auditory representations. But I'm also including inner speech here because, which is the internal monologue most people experience, and usually in a natural language. And I think I'm taking inner speech to involve phonological representation, so I think it could be classified as a kind of image. So recently, at least two philosophers held this view very explicitly. One is Jesse Prince. He says that we do not have conscious states couched in non-perceptual formats. And another is Peter Carruthers. So he holds the view that the stream of consciousness is purely sensory based. And both of them include inner speech when they hold this idea that conscious thoughts involve images. But I think this idea is part of an empiricist tradition and philosophy. So you can similar views in Aristotle and Hume, and also the view that inner speech is central to human cognition and human consciousness also appears in several thinkers. Like Plato says that thinking is talking to himself, and Carruthers holds the view that natural language sentences are constitutive of conscious propositional thoughts, and many others. But I think there are two mental phenomena that seem to challenge this view. I think they're powerful counterexamples to this idea. One is unsymbolized thinking, and the other is aphantasia. So I'm going to start with unsymbolized thinking. So this is a kind of experience that has recently been described by a psychologist called Russell Hurlburt, and he developed this method of investigating conscious experience so he gives participants a beeper. They carry a beeper in their normal lives, and the beeper beeps at random intervals, and people are instructed to take notes and pay close attention to their conscious experience at that particular time and take notes, and they'll later discuss their experiences with the experimenter. And doing that with hundreds of participants, he found that unsymbolized thinking is one of the most frequent experiences. So that together with inner speech, inner seeing, feelings, and sensory awareness. So it seems that the frequency of this experience is very high, like as frequent as inner speech. And as he characterizes it, unsymbolized thinking is the experience of a thought that does not include the experience of words, images, or any other symbols. So just to give a few examples, so these unsymbolized thoughts are often described as wanderings. So one example is of Diane, who was standing in front of the shelves of breakfast cereal, wondering if she should buy a box. And Abigail is wondering whether Julio, her friend who will be giving her a ride that afternoon, will be driving his car or his pickup truck. So these people report having those thoughts that are conscious, but that do not involve images or inner speech. They say they're just wondering certain things. So this seems to be a problem for the view that conscious thoughts involve images, because this view predicts that unsymbolized conscious thoughts should be impossible. But in fact, we see that this is an apparently frequent phenomenon. People often describe having thoughts that do not involve images. So if that is a genuine phenomenon, it seems that this view is simply false. And another kind of mental phenomenon that made the news recently, and maybe many of you have heard of it, has recently been called aphantasia. So this is a condition that's known at least since the 19th century, but it was only named in a paper in 2015. And the usual, how people usually understand aphantasia is as an inability to produce, I hope my internet is working. So aphantasia, as it is commonly understood, is an inability to produce voluntary visual images. But I think from some studies, we can conclude that at least some of the aphantasic individuals also have an inability to produce images in other stream modalities, not just visual. So in one study, 26% imagery and other sensory modalities as well. I'm taking that to include inner speech, but in the paper, it's actually not clear, but these people say they lack auditory imagery. So I'm assuming that they would like inner speech as well. So this is usually attested via subjective report. So people answer questionnaires. There's lots of questionnaires that attempt to assess the vividness of imagery in different people. And some people will say that they have very vivid images, also that they have none. So in one example, investigation where he asked subjects to think of some definite object, like their breakfast table, and consider carefully the picture that comes to mind. And then he would ask questions about the image. Is the image dim or fairly clear? Are the colors quite distinct and natural? And some people would say that my powers are zero. I recollect the breakfast table, but I do not see it. Others would say that they thought this was just a figure of speech. And more recently, according to one estimate, 2 to 5% of people are very poor or non-visual imagers. And in this survey, describes that some people claim never having images and that they thought this was just a phrase. So again, I think this is a problem for the view that conscious thoughts involve images, because these people seem to have conscious thoughts that are only non-sensory based. So it's an even more extreme case than the unsymbolized thinking, because they seem to lack images altogether. So here are two possible replies that the proponents of this view could formulate. They could say, well, the first one I call the error reply. So they could say, well, these people are just mistaken. They do experience images, but for some reason they fail to recognize that. So maybe they suffer from some kind of metacognitive deficit. So the images are there. It's just their problem that they can't see that. And the second reply would be to say that, yeah, it's true that people do have unsymbolized thinking, and maybe it's true that the thoughts of aphantasic individuals really are unsymbolized, but these thoughts are just not conscious. So I think this second reply is not very plausible, because unsymbolized thoughts, they can be reported, they can give rise to decisions and behaviors, and which seems, I think, to suggest that they're access conscious, so they can be available for reasoning and other mental processes. But also if we consider the case of aphantasic individuals, if we would have to say that they have no conscious thoughts at all, that they're essentially like zombies. And but surely there must be something it's like to be aphantasic. So I think the error reply is probably better. And Carruthers and Prince, I think, have held this view. Carruthers explicitly about unsymbolized thinking, and Prince discusses the imageless thoughts, and he says that people who report imageless thoughts are just simply wrong about their own mental states. They don't, as far as I know, they don't really address the aphantasia case, but I think we can extract that kind of reply from them. And I think that's not completely unreasonable. So Schwitzgebel, for instance, he argues that people have very poor understanding of their own visual imagery experiences. And he says that based on the fact that there is a poor correlation between self-reported imagery abilities and performance on psychological tests. So people who say that they have very strong and poor visual images perform in a very similar way in tasks that seem to require the use of mental images, like mental rotation tasks. But I think there are problems with this reply. So the first one, I think it's that it's ad hoc. So I think Prince and Carruthers, when they argue for the view that conscious thoughts involve images, they explicitly rely on introspection. So they think this is a introspectively plausible idea. Apparently because they, as normal individuals, not aphantasics, they do experience images frequently. But they seem to think that introspection should not be relied on when it supports the opposite view. So it seems ad hoc. Plus, I think the method I described earlier, DES, for investigating conscious experience, is a serious attempt to do that, even though it is very difficult to investigate conscious experience, and I think no one would deny that. This is a serious attempt, and people, they're interviewed for several days, so they get better, and they become very competent at distinguishing between unsymbolized thinking and imagistic thoughts. And if anything, we would expect them to over-report inner speech and not report unsymbolized thinking, because as Hurlburt suggests, many people struggle at first at reporting unsymbolized thinking because they hold this common presupposition that thinking occurs in words. So, but the fact that they still report unsymbolized thinking, I think, suggests that their reports should be relied on, or that they're at least in part reliable. And the fact is that there's much research that has been done already on aphantasia and thinking. These are just recently being studied. So there isn't much support yet, but there is at least one study with a patient that he lost his ability to have visual images, and but he was interestingly still capable of performing imagery tasks like mental rotation tasks, and they scanned his brain and compared his activation patterns with control individuals when he was asked to imagine the faces of famous people, and they found that the pattern of activations was very different. So he was activating more frontal areas, which are associated with more cognitive tasks, and and there was less activation in the face perception area. So I think this suggests that maybe contra Schwitzgebel, there might be alternative ways to solve tasks like mental rotation, and that maybe the fact that performance on those tasks doesn't correlate with differences in report should speak against the tasks and not necessarily against the reports. How much time do I still have?
5 minutes.
Okay. And so there are there is at least one other experiment that suggests that there really might be a difference between aphantasics individuals and normal visualizers, which involved a binocular rivalry test. So the idea is that they present different images to each eye, and when that happens, we don't see both at the same time. We choose, or perception selects one. And when you ask someone to imagine, so say imagine the green Gabor patch, and they show, and afterwards they show the person the green and the red one. They'll after imagining, they will see first the one that they were asked to imagine. But the same thing does not happen with aphantasics, according to this experiment. So they were asked to imagine a green Gabor patch, say, and then they were shown the green and red, but they didn't show a preference to the one they were asked to imagine. So this might be a more objective or a better psychological evidence that doesn't rely purely on subjective reports. But definitely more research is needed. So, but what I try to suggest is that philosophers sometimes might find it easy to dismiss subjective reports, just saying, these people are just mistaken. But I think they should be more careful and pay close attention to the empirical evidence before they do that. But, as I said, there isn't really much research that has been done, and most of the research focus on the case of visual images and not on the case of inner speech. But I think there is independent evidence that suggests that maybe not everybody has inner speech. So with the DES method, they found that some people never report inner speech. And there is data also suggesting that patients with aphasia can have impaired inner speech but preserved outer speech. So to conclude, I think that we shouldn't just dismiss subjective reports, but it is true that it would be better to have more objective measures, and that would confirm, I think, the phenomena I described here, unsymbolized thinking and in aphantasia. But if we assume that these people are being honest and that their reports should be taken seriously, I think these are two cases that present a real problem in that they are fatal for the view that conscious thoughts are always sensory-based. That conclusion is very negative, but I think maybe we can extract something more positive, that maybe this can be taken to support the view that conscious thoughts occur in the language of thought that is not the same as any natural language, and that maybe we can be conscious of amodal concepts. And I think it also has implications for other views, so views about the nature of concepts, about self-knowledge. So for instance, we might have direct knowledge of some propositional attitudes and not just inferred or interpreted, as someone like Carruthers, for instance, would claim. And in his view, I think he would have to say that aphantasics have horrible self-knowers. So this would be an interesting thing to test. And there are very common views about episodic memory that take episodic memory to be re-experiencing the past in some way. But if aphantasia is true, then that seems to be something that's not required for episodic memory. And I think this has implications for also views in cognitive phenomenology and imagination, but I'll stop here. Thank you. Here's my email in case anyone wants to write me.
Now we have time for questions. We have a question from Felipe. He said, I am curious about this notion of unsymbolized thinking. You said it doesn't involve awareness of words, images, or any symbols whatsoever. But what makes it the case that one wonders, for example, about whether one should buy the cereal box if one doesn't think using words like cereal or box, or doesn't deploy visual images of cereal boxes? What is the content of the unsymbolized thought?
I don't know, it's very speculative, but I would say they're just thinking in concepts. So they're just, that's why I said this might be taken to suggest that the language of thought can be conscious. They're just using a language of thought. They're thinking in concepts. It's just that it's in the absence of words. That's what I think, but maybe it's not very convincing.
We have another question from Nitamar. Do you think that inner speech is just inner talk, but not necessarily propositional?
Yeah, I think, yes, I think it is propositional. I think, yes, I would say it's both. Yeah.
We have another question from Carlos Marx. Estamos ouvindo.
Sí. I was wondering if you make an equivalence between sensory-based thoughts and imagistic thoughts, and why do you think that if at the end we prove that not all or most of the parts of our thoughts are not based on images, that will be a problem for the idea that our thought is based on, or is most of the part sensory based? Do you think that if we disprove the idea that we're thinking images, that will be fatal for the idea that thought is based on sensory modalities? And why do you think that if maybe there is not an equivalence between thinking in images and sensory-based thought?
So I think I wasn't distinguishing. I wasn't making a distinction between sensory-based thoughts and imagistic thoughts. I think I should.
I think that maybe we can. Most of our thoughts are based on sensory modalities, and that's it. That is one thesis. And another thesis is that with in images or in another kind of vehicles like maps or whatever.
Like what?
Maps.
Maps.
Yeah. Like the thesis about the vehicle of the thought is a different thesis, and the thesis, if the thought is based on sensory modalities, is more like an empirist thesis, and it doesn't have to. It doesn't have to be related to the idea that thoughts are thinking in images. Thoughts are thought in images.
Yeah,
like you can you could divide the thesis in two parts.
Yeah, that's interesting.
It is not clear for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I would have to think about that. But yes, so I think, yeah, you're suggesting that maybe we can think in maps, but that's not sensory based. So,
or the other way,
yeah.
maybe we can think in based on sensory modalities outputs,
Yeah.
but that doesn't imply that we think in maps or in propositions or in sentences or in images. Like the vehicle is, the thing about the vehicle is one idea, and the other idea is empirism, if thoughts are based in experience.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about when I was saying sensory based, I was thinking of the vehicles of conscious thoughts. So I was just meaning to say that the vehicles are sensory in some sense. But yeah, I would have to think about cases such as maps, but I think usually when scientists say that we use maps, they mean that in a subpersonal sense, maybe, that we don't really experience maps consciously in our head. So I was just focusing on the case of conscious thoughts. But yeah, I think it's interesting. I'll think about that.
We have one, I think we can only have one last question from Cristiano Batista.
Thank you, Raquel, for the presentation. I was thinking about if this we can compare this kind of impairment, this aphantasia thing, with people that are blind from birth, for instance, that have never saw anything, and how this can have an impact both in the concept of what a phenomenon is, and if there is any evidence that it has some impact on the language capability of those persons.
Yeah, I think that the comparison is interesting because, but only, so I try to distinguish two senses, I think what I call partial aphantasia and total aphantasia. So I think the partial sense would be similar to the case of the blind, because yeah, they don't have visual, at least in the case of congenital blind, they don't have visual imagery as well. And so yeah, there's this similarity that groups would be incapable of having visual images, but in the case of the total aphantasia, it's more extreme because so you could say in the case of the blind that that's not a counterexample to the view that consciousness involves images, because they can still use other kinds of sensory images to think. So they can use auditory or tactile or whatever. But that's why I think the case of total aphantasia is extreme and not just a partial one, because they supposedly lack all kinds of imagery, and that would really speak against the view that conscious thoughts involve images. And you, what was the other part of your question? Sorry.
Ask if it had some impact on the concept. On the concept of phenomenon, and if have or impact on the language capability of those persons.
Yeah, so the phenomenon, yeah, it's interesting because many people, so as I said, that this might have implications for views about cognitive phenomenology, because many people think that cognitive phenomenology can be reduced to the phenomenology of whatever sensory states people have. So the phenomenon or phenomenology is reducible to the sensory states. And if aphantasia is real, then these people would have to say that they have no conscious thoughts, they have no phenomenal consciousness because they have no sensory images, which I think is very extreme. So it sort of pushes us to saying that concepts can have a knowledge even outside or be sensory representations. And as for language, I don't know. I think that's an empirical question. I don't know, but I'd say maybe not, because if it had, we would have identified aphantasic individuals earlier, and it took like we only named that condition in 2015. So it's apparently not something that's obvious. It requires a lot of attention and research. So.
Thanks, Raquel.
Thank you.